All right, so I think let's get started. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'm David Briggs, Chair of the New South Wales Division of the Colour Society of Australia, the Australian member body of the International Colour Association, or AIC. The Colour Society of Australia is a 100% volunteer-run, not-for-profit organisation, and we welcome all to our events and membership. This event continues a series of webinars presented free of charge by the Colour Society of Australia New South Wales Division since 2020. We have a full house, or nearly full house, of 95 registrants from all around the world, about half from Australia, by the way, and the rest from all over. Absolutely incredible range of countries today. So we're asking everyone to stay muted during the presentation, but if you have any questions for Kory, please submit them in the chat during the talk and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. We're absolutely delighted to have Kory with us today. Kory Stamper is an author and lexicographer who has spent nearly 30 years thinking about how to define the words that define us, and 20 years as an editor at Merriam-Webster. She's written about her time as a dictionary writer in Word by Word, The Secret Life of Dictionaries, book published in 2017. Her moderate obsession with colour terms and colour names that began at Merriam-Webster led her to archives across the US, several strangers' homes, and ultimately to her second non-fiction book, True Colour, The Strange and Spectacular Quest to Define Colour, From Azure to Zinc Pink, published this year. Though no longer a workaday commercial lexicographer, she keeps her hand in by doing language revitalization work with the indigenous Miami Nation of Indiana, where she is currently puzzling over how best define the Miami color terms that refer to some blues and some greens, but not all blues and not all greens. Thank you, Kory.
Thanks so much for having me. Let me share my screen right fast. I am so delighted to be here. I love yakking with people, and I have never spoken to a group in Australia. So thank you very much for letting me crash your Sunday morning. Today I want to talk about the story I tell in my book, True Color, just extremely condensed down. And that is the story of how one dictionary and one color standard in the early 20th century in America sought to change the way that we think about and talk about color. And we'll talk about whether it was a hit or not. So some of you have seen some parts of this presentation, but not all of it, and others of you have seen other parts of it. So welcome. Now you get the whole story. I want to talk today about the ISCC NBS method of designating colors and a dictionary of color names. Now, this is a color standard that was put out in the US by the US government and a partner group called the Inter-Society Color Council in the 50s. And it was to be the be-all, end-all of color standards. It had a weird start. Unlike a lot of ways of designating colors, it didn't come from sort of a broader philosophical way of approaching colors. It came from one specific request to one specific person. The US Pharmacopoeia, which has been published since the early 1800s. This is the list of all compounding drugs in the US. And it's still published today. It's now online. But the Pharmacopoeia had been in revisions and had been in different editions for quite a while. And one of the important parts of the Pharmacopoeia is describing all of the various drugs or ingredients that can be used to make medicines, compounded other drugs, things like that. So there had to be some common descriptors, and color was really one important part of describing the difference between different drugs that might look the same or might have opposite effects to each other. So There were problems, though. So this is an early, from the sixth revision, an early description of what a permanganate solution looks like. When heated to redness, that's unclear, the salt gives off oxygen and leaves a black residue of an alkaline reaction. How black is it? And can you tell it's black if the whole solution is heated to redness? These are vague terms, but don't worry, it gets specific. It says a very dilute solution of the salt has a rose color without a tinge of green, which is good because rose and green are not close to each other in most, color ordering systems. So it's not that helpful unless you are a pharmacist or a druggist who has compounded and heated permanganate solution a lot. But if you aren't, and this is your first time doing it, well, you might kill someone. One of the other problems too is that the descriptions of colors within the pharmacopoeia are not consistent from edition to edition. So let's talk about powdered aloe, which was a really important compounding drug that was used in a lot of different things. In the sixth revision, it is yellowish brown or orange brown. It is not greenish, very important. In the seventh revision, it is also dark ruby red, still not greenish. So at least that's consistent. In the eighth revision, it's yellowish brown to blackish brown. We've lost orange brown and dark ruby red. And in the ninth revision, it's yellowish brown or orange brown to blackish brown. This is all confusing. So what is aloe eventually? Nobody knows, and no one ever could figure this out. So one of the problems was if we don't have consistent ways to describe colors, then we have all sorts of problems with the pharmacopoeia. And the pharmacopoeia was not just for use by pharmacists, it was also an important thing to refer to for legal standards, to determine when drugs were counterfeit, or to help law enforcement. If someone has been poisoned by cyanide, they will have a particular blue cast, but how blue is blue? One of the people who was in charge of revising the pharmacopoeia was Edwin Gathercole, and he called together a bunch of other color people he knew and said, hey, we should take this up. We should do this for the pharmacopoeia. We should figure this out. That group of people all met in 1931 in New York City at the Museum of Science and Industry. There was a big museum exhibit happening about color science, color perception. And when they met, they determined that the best way forward was for all of them in all of their different industries to band together. That the only way they were going to find an answer to a plain language system to describe colors was if they all pitched in. There were 20 groups, delegates from 20 groups, who responded to this call put out by E.M. Gathercole to provide greater uniformity in the designation and standardization of color. Now, it's really important to understand that those words that are in the charter for the Inter-Society Color Council, designation and standardization of color, are really kind of outliers in this period. So we're in the 30s and there's lots of other things happening in color. We have jumps in color reproduction. We are setting standard illuminants. We're determining who the standard observer is. But the ISCC, as this group would come to be called, really wanted to zero in on designation, color naming, and color describing because this was a problem that all of the member organizations of the ISCC were struggling with. And those organizations were varied. You had anyone from the American Psychological Association all the way to the National Academy of Design, the Optical Society of America, the American Chemical Society, and someone brand new, the Society for Motion Picture Engineers. All of these people struggled with ways to describe color within their field to each other and outside of their field. This was such an important thing, they actually called it problem number 2. It was one of the founding problems that the ISCC was going to solve. And when they met, they asked for volunteers to help deal with problem 2. And they got I.H. Godlove. Now, I.H. Godlove Isaac Hahn was his full name. He never went by his full name. He was IH to his friends. He was a chemist. He came out of the University of Illinois, which had the premier PhD chemistry program in America. It actually launched most of the major chemists that went through World War II and worked on the Manhattan Project. And he was really good at what he did. He was a physical chemist who then went right after graduating to work for a color standards group called the Munsell Company. Now, Munsell dealt mostly with color standards for manufacturing and for industry, and he was one of their chief scientists. He dealt a lot in what's called small color specification and differentiation. And he absolutely loved the idea of solving problem two. He wrote up a memo for the ISCC in 1932, right after they met. It was, by his lights, a short memo. It was 8 pages long. But he wanted to lay out what he saw the problem being and how they needed to approach it. It set some important groundwork. So problem two, he said, is it highlights their different methods to describe color. So pharmacists use one method, scientists use another. And neither of those methods is right or wrong. They're just specific to a context. He felt that problem two should begin with specification, that is, measuring and specifying what colors were, rather than trying to describe them. Measurement, the scientific absolute for determining color, should be the thing that drives description. But at the same time, whatever their solution is, it should be broadly applicable. They shouldn't have to do this again. It should work for the pharmacopoeia. It should work for the Society for Motion Picture Engineers. It should work for artists. If we're going to make a plain color system, then why not make it broadly applicable? And the other most important thing is it needs to find a way to translate highly technical ways of specifying color, so things like tri-stimulus values, into very non-technical ways of specifying color. This needed to be accessible to lay people, but also as accurate as possible. Now, I'm not a scientist, and from my perspective, this is a very non-scientific view of how to approach this problem. The idea that it needs to be non-technical, that should be broadly applicable, this is not what a typical scientist from America, from this era, would say. They would say, we can solve this problem, one problem, from every possible scientific angle, and if y'all can't hang with that, that's your problem. So he's a scientist. Where did he get this? Well, while Godlove was also working at this museum, setting up this exhibition, he had a side gig where he was actually hired by the biggest dictionary company in America, Merriam-Webster, to write color definitions for the Webster's New International Dictionary, 2nd edition. What is that? The New International Second, or the Second as we call it in the house, was the unabridged dictionary to beat in America in the early 1900s. It was unabridged, and it was meant to be absolutely encyclopedic in its knowledge. Typically, what happened when you had an unabridged dictionary is instead of relying on a host of in-house editors to write things, you actually hired out for expertise. So you got hundreds of subject matter experts to write the definitions for their field. And the more qualified the expert, the better. Godlove was not initially approached by Merriam-Webster. Another much more senior scientist was. But the senior scientist, who Godlove respected greatly, asked Godlove to take on a particular part of the defining work for the dictionary. And this was a part of the defining work that this senior scientist felt was absolutely, positively loathsome, the worst thing, utterly beneath him. And that was to define color names. The scientist, when he was contracted, said, yeah, I'll do color terms for you, but he really meant colorimetric terms, scientific terms. And when the company told him, no, we also need you to define color names, he said, and this is a direct quote, that they were arbitrary and fanciful, used only for sales. And he felt absolutely no way that this was worth his time. Godlove, however, up and coming, maybe he could give it a shot. So in my book, I go through the intensive back and forth, I'll say, between the dictionary company and these two scientists coming up with a plain language description to use as a definition for colors. And they did eventually get there. The older scientist created a rubric, which was a color with a hue, red, yellow, green, blue, and hue, of high, medium, or low saturation and high, medium, or low brilliance. Now, this is really different from how colors were defined previously. In earlier dictionaries, colors were often defined by their uses in heraldry or their uses in a particular industry. They were not given many descriptors at all. You would get things like a red, which, sure, there's lots of those, which red? Or you might get a description of the word's etymology, ultramarine, meaning ultramarine coming from across the sea. Well, that's not helpful. What color is that? So this rubric, though kind of bare bones, is actually a really scientifically oriented system. It's using brilliance to talk about what various color systems might call value, lightness. It's using the word saturation to talk about intensity or chromaticity. And in distinguishing between a color and what hue that color is, it's also nudging the reader into the idea that color perception and color measurement were linked, but were not the same. So this is a tidy summation, and Godlove dove in. He wrote these definitions. He decided that in order to be scientifically accurate, he needed to base all of his definitions on measurements. So he took measurements of the color chips in a brand new color standard that had just been published called A Dictionary of Color by Mertz and Paul. It was one of the newest, it was one of the best researched color dictionaries on the market, and it had some scientific basis. So he did that. He defined about 1,500 terms, and they ended up in the dictionary much like this: a color, reddish yellow in hue, of low saturation and low brilliance. Great. But as he was doing this work, and as he put himself in the shoes of the layperson, he really began to question whether this definition did what it was supposed to do, which is communicate clearly to the layperson what a color was. Is brilliance really clear to people? What about saturation? No one goes to the Dulux store and asks for a blue of medium saturation and high brilliance. People don't do that. They say, I want light blue. I want dark blue. I want a light blue green. So he felt it was not quite right, but he felt like it's headed in the right direction. What if he could take this and use it kind of to solve problem two? It was important to him that problem two be solved scientifically. And so what he did was he used the Munsell color system, which was kind of a bridge between scientific notation and the way that lay people talked about color. You had three dimensions. You had value, that's lightness, darkness, chroma, that's intensity, and then you had hue. And the hues were all named using standard English. And the way that it was oriented by individual steps of perception, okay, that gave scientists some kind of way to be able to order color. So he said, let's use this. They use 5 hues in the Munsell system: red, yellow, green, blue, and purple. Everyone knows what those are. For value, well, he already knows that people are not going to handle any kind of numbers inside of the USP, inside of the pharmacopoeia. But he says, well, what if we take these measurements, value and chroma, and we divide this 10-point scale and this 12-point scale up and give them English descriptions. He already knew from working with the dictionary that we have set terms to describe the different points on value and the different points on chroma. So he and a small committee came up with this little guide where they said, if your Munsell value is above 7.8, then we're going to call it very light. And if the chroma is above 11.5, we're going to call it very strong. So his value scale, light to dark, and his chroma scale was strong to weak. And he said, well, if we can standardize these and we can measure colors and give them a chroma and a value and a hue, then you can kind of take this and smash them together into plain language definitions. Now, the Munsell system only uses 5 hues, and there are a lot of different hues between red and purple, for instance. So Godlove fell back on what he had seen when he was working with Merriam-Webster, and he said, okay, let's use ish at the end of one of these terms to talk about what direction red might be leaning, right? Is it a reddish purple, which means it's more purple? Or is it a purplish red, which means it's more red? All right. And you do have some weird descriptions then between red and purple because of the way the Munsell system is, but that's okay because certainly we can come up with things that a normal person can figure out. And for instance, a light, very strong red purple for permanganate solutions of a concentration of 10,000 milliliters per seems to say, well, light, very strong red purple is definitely better than heated to redness. A very strong purplish red purple, definitely better than heated to redness. He presented this to the committee and they were interested, but he had one other idea. And this was entirely from the time that he spent defining words for Merriam-Webster. While he was in the syntax mines, he said, what if instead of these kinds of descriptions, light, very strong red, purple, what if we went exactly where the layperson is? What if we take these and we map them on to common commercial color names? Despite what scientists want or what they believed, commercial color names are the way that 99% of the lay public engages with color words. This is one example that I took from the Merriam-Webster files. Everything underlined in these 3 paragraphs is a color name. Now, not all of them are lasting or common color names, and not all of the ways that they're described are useful for any purpose, maybe. In the first paragraph, we have ambroon, which is described as soft as a harvest moon. I don't know what that means. Down in the bottom paragraph, there's rondac, deep as a quiet pool at evening. These are not so much definitions as they are vibes, but we can still look through all of the collections that Merriam-Webster had of words used in context across history to say, surely we can come up with a list of common commercial color names that have been pretty consistent that would correspond to a specific enough color to lay people that then we wouldn't have to do the whole very dark reddish purple red thing. So in addition to the very dark purple reddish red, he also suggested that they give common color names in the pharmacopoeia to describe drugs. Now, not ideal. Cocoa, coffee, rust, or russet brown. Is that a range of colors? Is that saying it's all the same color? Are we saying that powdered socotrine aloe is somewhere in the middle, colorimetrically, of those colors? It was an interesting idea. The membership of the ISCC was not into it, but they really liked the other way, the very light reddish purple red. And they said, we like that. We're approving that as the short descriptions. Have at it. So Godlove got together with some scientists at the National Bureau of Standards. It's a US group that is responsible for measurements and standards. And they had a uh, colorimetry section. Those are the words I'm trying to say. He knew those people. They all got together. And this system of defining, which was later called the ISCC NBS method, was born. And then the real work began, because while they were doing all of the measurements, they also had to sell it to people. So starting in 1940, members of the ISCC, and especially Godlove, went to conferences, they gave papers, they went to different government organizations trying to get people on board for the ISCC NBS system. So these are samples from the ISCC newsletter, and there were 4 newsletters a year. And in every newsletter, there were multiple items about how various groups thought the ISCC NBS was just amazing. Best thing since sliced bread. So part of the reason they wanted to do this was because by the time they finished all of their specifications, they wanted to be able to publish them and say, look, this is an established and creditable system. It's not an experiment. Science is behind it. And a lot of people were very excited about it. But there were problems with the method as it stood. There were particularly problems in trying to get lay people to think of color the way that color scientists thought of color. Remember, the Munsell color system only uses those 5 primary hues: red, yellow, green, blue, and purple. And purple was really only thrown in for slobs like me. And this limited palette works great once you understand the system, but things like dark orange and dark yellow really confuse lay people. So in a colorimetrically ideal world, when someone says dark orange, I am supposed to be way down here. Now, I would call that brown. If you ask me, not a scientist, what dark orange is, I'm going to be kind of up here. And if you say, no, see, that's actually strong and moderate orange, dark orange is brown, I will be very confused and say, what are you talking about? Pumpkins are dark orange. Sweet potatoes are dark orange. Those are dark orange because that's how we describe them in common English. Now, Godlove and the committee realized this was going to be problematic, but they just needed to start getting measurements and start collecting color samples. Godlove, though, thought that there could be a way to get this a little bit more fine-grained and to do something a little bit more intuitive. And so he went back to the dictionary. So we have now spanned almost 30 years or almost 20 years after the second came out. And 20 years is a long time for an unabridged dictionary to be out. So they wanted to do a third. And the guy they got to oversee the third, who's over on the right there, is Philip Babcock Gove. He was really unlike any previous editor-in-chief that they had ever had, because rather than coming out of the humanities and being sort of a tenured professor of English language, he was, in fact, a linguist. And linguistics at this point in time, in the mid-20th century, were undergoing this huge change where it was less about sort of etymology and finding word histories, and it became much more scientifically rigorous. We started developing things like phonological systems to describe sounds and started looking at things like structural ways that language worked. Gove considered himself to be a scientist as a linguist, and he wanted the third to not just be an encyclopedic book, he wanted it to be the most scientifically and technically accurate dictionary on the market. So when Godlove came a-knocking again in the late 40s, and he got himself back into the dictionary headspace, Gove was thrilled. And Gove's editors began working with Godlove to define colors for the third. Now, no defining happened for quite a long time. But Godlove began to say, well, how about if we're going to be looking again at plain language use, and we're going to take a survey, as lexicographers do, of how words are used and move towards the way that usage works as opposed to prescribing something, this might actually help solve the ISCC NBS problem. So Godlove did what lexicographers do. He read, he surveyed as many color names and their descriptions in generic texts and scientific texts that he could. And that's the point at which he realized this whole thing needs to be completely redone. The first change was that the 5 colors from the Munsell system were not going to cut it. They needed way more colors as their basic color terms. And so he began looking at what are the basic color terms in English, and he started coming up with a much broader list that would have made Munsell spin in his grave. We add orange, which lots of color scientists said was the worst thing you could do. Orange is not colorimetrically pure, and it's also not lexically pure. How can you do that? He added violet and purple. He added pink because light red and pink, though they are the same, people don't think of light red as pink. He added olive in addition to brown because olive spans several hue planes and is kind of a good way to describe those really dark yellow greens and dark, dark, dark orange yellows. And so suddenly we go from having 5 primary colors to having about 14. And he asked a colleague who is Dean Brewster Judd at the National Bureau of Standards to help out charting things, because once you add more core colors, well, now you have to change the boundaries of every hue plane because they all now get different names. And as they did that work, he discovered something slightly terrifying. Now, prior to this work, Godlove had come up with essentially a grid to help describe colors for the ISCC NBS method. So you'll see these are combinations of value and of chroma. We go from light to dark, we go from weak to strong, and then we've got kind of in the middle there, we're going to come up with medium to describe chroma and moderate to describe value. And this was just slapped on top of every hue plane, and that's how it worked. But as they're mapping things out, 2 things emerged. The first was, people don't talk about colors this way. So you remember this big giant mess? Godlove read again these kinds of things, but instead of focusing on the color names, he focused on the descriptions. And he found that there were some common words that we use to describe colors that were combinations, for instance, of weak and dark. We called them dull. Moderate or strong and dark were called dark. Deep was also in there. And he started realizing that we can't just use light and dark and weak and strong to describe everything. That's not clear enough. But if we use words like dull or dark or deep or pale, people get that. But the thing is, if you take that and you map it on, each of those descriptors is used for different groups of colors depending on the hue plane. In other words, the boundaries for each of those colors shifts from hue to hue to hue. Every single hue page has a different set of boundaries around what's strong, what's deep, what's light. Now, as irritating as this is, it actually means that the ISCC NBS system can be specific enough that it might accommodate all common usage now. And the fascinating thing is that because Godlove was looking at descriptions of common color names to find these descriptors and map them onto the Munsell hue charts, that also means that Godlove could start plotting commercial color names on this scientifically rigorous system and thereby get consistent definitions for them. He was so excited, he wrote to Merriam-Webster. He sent them a list of proposed definitions based on the ISCC NBS method. He sent them 420 sample definitions. I think they asked for 10. And Merriam-Webster was very, very interested in this, but they did have a couple of questions. So they said, okay, let's look at deep pink. According to you, you're saying that begonia is a deep pink. And you're suggesting that we say you should also see Fiesta, Sweet William, Coral, and Geranium pink. They all fall in the deep pink pocket, they were calling these little chunks. And Godlove said, yeah. And Gove said, what are you, nuts? We can't do that. That doesn't make any sense from a dictionary point of view. Because if we tell people that begonia and Fiesta and Geranium pink and Coral and Watermelon and Sweet William are all a deep pink in dictionary land, that means they're all the same color. Are you saying they're all the same color? And Godlove was like, well, they're all deep pinks, but they're slightly different. There are colorimetric differences between each of them. And Gove said, well, why are you not telling us what those differences are? The important thing to remember about the Munsell system is that it is a color space. So Godlove's working not in 2 dimensions, but in 3. So we do have value, we have chroma, and then we also have hue. Each of these pages for the hue planes stack on one another. So if we have 3 dimensions of color, then what if we brought those 3 dimensions into the definitions themselves? And that is how Merriam-Webster's 3rd New International Unabridged Dictionary ended up with definitions like a deep pink, begonia, here we are, that is bluer, lighter, and stronger than average coral right here. Bluer than Fiesta. So here's Fiesta, here's begonia. Begonia is swinging towards blue. And bluer, so we're swinging this way, and stronger, further this way, than Sweet William over here. This rubric is brilliant because it doesn't just describe color in relation to other colors using these common color names as sort of subjective comparatives, but it sort of implicitly teaches people how to navigate color in 3 dimensions, how to navigate a color space. And this is something that science had been trying to get people to do at this point for almost 2 centuries and had not done it, because how do you do that using a metric that people understand? Godlove also realized that if we can do this for the dictionary, then we can also backwards engineer it for the ISCC NBS. And that's exactly what they did. They took 13 different color standards that were in use, and they began plotting all of their colors and then listed them by pocket in the back of the ISCC NBS method, along with the internal reference number for each of those colors. So if you wanted to know how Watermelon and Sweet William and Gaiety and Geranium Pink all looked together, they were all deep pinks, all you had to do is go in and say, okay, I see Geranium Pink in Taylor, Knock, and Granville. I see it in Mertz and Paul. And then if you are a color scientist or you work in the industry, you actually can go pick up those standards and look at the color chips and actually measure them. This opens up a simple color naming and color defining system to everyone in science, industry, and the arts. It's great. There were some complications. So the first and biggest one is that I.H. Godlove died suddenly in 1954. This was 1 year before the ISCC NBS method was formally published, and this was 7 years before Webster's third was released. He died in the middle of defining. Well, so that's the end of that. It's not quite the end of that. We had the ISCC NBS standard. It was published. It did not have any color charts because why would you need color charts for a text-based system? But it turns out people wanted color charts. And Merriam-Webster, well, they would just have to find a different scientist. And they did. I've talked about Dr. Godlove. I would like to now talk about Mrs. Godlove. Margaret Godlove married IH in 1949, I believe. She was a scientist in her own right. She worked at DuPont Dye Works. She was a file clerk, and then she was in the patent office. This was, in America, in the 30s, the highest that a woman could go if she did not have a PhD and wasn't willing to deal with a whole lot of misogyny. But she met IH while he was also working at DuPont. They got married, and she was so helpful to him as an assistant that she actually oversaw and did most of the on the ground defining for Merriam-Webster. She took measurements. She's the one who helped plot things. She's the one who helped decide what are the common color terms that we're going to compare every other color in this pocket to. So Margaret finished IH's defining. And then she turned her attention to something else because two of IH's colleagues, Henry Hemmendinger and, my goodness, I've forgotten his name, Davidson, were pinged by Munsell to create the Munsell glossy standard. And they, in turn, hired Margaret. She was perfect. She had all the tech chops. She knew everybody in the ISCC because IH knew everyone in the ISCC. She could source color constant pigments. She could take meticulous notes. She could do all of the spectrographic measurements. She could use the glossimeter. She could do it all. And she did. These are notes from her work that she did for Davidson and Hemmendinger. And her work led specifically to the Munsell glossy standard. When that was published, it reignited interest in the ISCC NBC standard as well. And in a fitting bit of symmetry, she helped produce the color charts just for those pocket colors for the standard that IH started in 1931. Okay, so Margaret solved the problem. Well, no, because even though the ISCC NBS system was very widespread, there was a lot of interest, its fate was mostly sealed by the book that it was aligned with, which was a dictionary. Webster's Third was heralded by many people as too loose, too permissive, but by a huge chunk of humanities specialists as way too sciencey. This is Jacques Barzun, who was a famous critic of Webster's Third, who says a science obviously cannot admit that from the outset language is something more than speech. He ends his little diatribe. This is not a little diatribe, by the way. This is about a 10-page diatribe in very small font, with feelings attached to words. He felt that the scientism that Gove had brought to the dictionary ruined language. Feelings attached to words. And boy, do they. Webster's Third, following the ISCC NBS, defines turquoise, for instance, as a variable color averaging a light greenish blue and also a light bluish green. Colorimetrically, that's where the turquoises fall in the range. They cluster as a light greenish blue and a light bluish green. And scientists understand that those are slightly different colors, but people don't. Some people say turquoise is blue and others say turquoise is green. And now the dictionary of record is telling me that turquoise is both blue and green. I don't think so. And this was also a problem on the ISCC NBS side too, even for specialists. Because in the back, the ISCC NBS lists all of their terms. And let's say that you are someone who's making metal cabinets in 1962 and you want to make them aqua to match the latest aqua car put out by Chevy. Well, which aqua? We have two aquas. And also, we have all these other aquas, some of which are really the same as aqua. One bright aqua is the same as aqua, and some of them are really different. So we have a light blue green and a light green blue in the top line. But down at the bottom, we've got very pale green, VPG, and very pale blue, VPB. I don't think so. We have pale green, we have light green blue. When you're trying to figure out what's the hot new color this spring, and the car guy says it's aqua, which aqua are we talking about? The problem with any standard, whether it's a dictionary or whether it's a color standard, is that the minute it's published, it's set in amber. Color names and trends change over time. Pink was really fashionable in the mid-50s, and in the 60s, we've got Barbie, we have Marilyn Monroe, and this pink in particular was kind of the it pink. We all know that. It went by many names, so you obviously know that the name of this pink was shrimp pink. Now, shrimp pink, back then, pink, this wonderful, amazing luxury experience. Think prawn cocktail, for instance. It doesn't scream that now. When we think of shrimp pink, we think of salmonella, which is also a canonically pink thing in our brains because it contains the word salmon. So the things that were considered to be common color names came and went, even when it seemed like they were sure bet. New colors are also being created all the time, and some of them, like day glow, fluorescing colors, phosphoring colors, they were not considered as part of the original ISCC NBS standard, and they're super hard to map. Do you have to redo the whole ISCC NBS standard to accommodate these colors? And if so, all of those color definitions will change again. And then there is the simple reality that Gove, the dictionary man, the one who complained that people would get all those deep pinks all wrong if you said they were the same, Gove was wrong. God loves, the God loveses definitions still stand in the online unabridged dictionary. But those long definitions were never carried over into any other Merriam-Webster dictionary because they're only so helpful. Unless you have a color chart in front of you and you have an explanation of how to navigate a color space, then really all of the blue or less strong, slightly lighter thans in this definition are just serving to confuse people. And so it turns out that a dark red is all you need at the same time for everybody who's not a scientist. Scientists wanted to like the ISCC NBS, and some of them still root for it today. But in the end, the weight of the dictionary and the criticisms of the dictionary steered people away from using the ISCC NBS. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much for sitting through it and being here.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Kory. Great. You're getting some reactions there. No, so please put some questions in the chat, or in fact, oh God, now I need to sort of work out how to you can just put your questions in the chat for a moment. I'll have a look at inviting you to unmute in a second. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I guess my takeaway is Erwin Priest had a point. But yeah, so to distinguish the difference between the systematic way of dividing up Munsell space into English language categories and the more sophisticated one that is different for each hue, that seems to be still something that's useful today. It's certainly something that I use in sort of just making sure I'm consistent on, which paints I'm calling an orange and which are a brown and so forth. But it's the poetic names that there's I'm just thinking about that issue because if you're getting these poetic names from different sources, from different books and so forth, and different ones from different books, and okay, you could colorimetrically analyze the swatch that they provide for that color. But probably they're all imagining those colors as not just that exact colorimetric measurement. They're imagining them as all having a range like turquoise or aqua. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
probably ill considered to it's suspect to actually even do what they did in the dictionary and say purpler than
Yeah.
coral and what have you. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, the thing too is that this is both dictionaries and the ISCC and BS are artificial constructs, right? Both language and color make sense in context. So dictionary definitions are decontextualized.
Mm,
Color standards are decontextualized. And this is always an issue in color manufacture or color matching. You know that the minute that you put a color from a swatch on anything that is not, that doesn't
mm,
exactly match the gloss of that swatch or doesn't exactly match the texture, it's going to change the perception. If you put that swatch next to an opponent color, it's going to change the perception. So
very true.
even within these, even with, it is a tidy system for describing color to lay people. And I think it can help. But it's really weird to sort of try and apply it systematically to science and manufacture because those have really different considerations. And even art has different considerations. You know that like one company's cadmium yellow is going to be slightly oranger than another company's cadmium
Absolutely.
yellow. And
Yes.
so,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. The
Mm,
cadmium orange is definitely it's quite a lot redder in one brand and
mm,
yellower in another. Yep, for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
All right. I do you want to have a look at the chat or will I read them out? What's the best way? I'll read out.
Why? Yeah, we'll read them out so that they're in the record.
Okay, I'll read out the first one that's there's a thank you, and then the next one is enjoyed the talk, thanks. I found Berlin and Kay's basic color terms really useful for thinking about how different cultures name colors. They also argued that despite those differences, languages tend to follow a fairly structured and universal pattern as color terms develop. Did their hypothesis influence or complicate the way lexicographers define and standardize color terms in dictionaries? So
It did
Berlin.
not, yeah, it didn't complicate or influence lexicographers, but linguists still, there's a whole body of literature that goes back even before Berlin and Kay to talking about linguistic universals, and color names for some reason are a thing that linguists love to say are universals. One of the things that it has done that is interesting is for language revitalization, which I'm involved in, and of course, language revitalization in Australia and in New Zealand with Maori are very important. And and it complicates that work because it is an English-centric based way of viewing color. So, my bio says that I'm trying to figure out how to define for the Miami Nation of Indiana the Miami word for some blues and some greens, but not all blues and all greens. This is an issue because I know from Berlin and Kay, and I know from looking at the historic record for this language that the blues and greens are grouped not colorimetrically. they're grouped
Mhm.
socially, they're grouped mythologically. Um, Grass and water are the same color, but other kinds of grass and water are not the same color. The sky is a different color. And that makes it complicated only because Berlin and Kay indicates that, like, well, blue and green should be separate. And they're not. They're not always. That's the biggest thing that I take away from Berlin and K is that it is an Anglo-centric, English-centric based way of dividing up color space, and not all languages divide up color space that way. I mean, very few world languages actually divide up color space that way. Some languages collapse blue and green together. Lots of them do. I believe Japanese does. I think Korean does. A lot of indigenous languages in North America do. Other languages separate blue into two or separate green into two, right? So it gets tricky because when we're talking about universals, you always have to judge your own presuppositions. What do you assume a universal to be? And if there is a true universal, especially when we talk about dividing up color space, who
Mm.
gets to decide where those divisions happen in color space?
Yes, I think that's right. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth about Berlin and K and how valid it is anyway. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm. All right. Thanks. Kate says so much complexity highlighted. Thank you. Where is this research going from here?
Well, I'm taking a nap personally. So what's interesting is that the desire to describe, to come up with a way to describe color, and not just the way that we describe color, but ways we talk about color perception or the ways we talk about color science, that's still very much present. There is a group called the Color Literacy Project that
Is.
there is that David is a consultant on, and I'm a consultant on, and where the idea is we're trying to come up with a curriculum, a global curriculum to teach color using a standardized set of language for elementary school, so primary school all the way through post-secondary, to basically educate people in color science. And part of that is developing a sort of fixed set of terms that we can start with and then build on as people go. So there's still a lot of work that's being done on this. Just it's from a much more education. It's really coming from the education space as opposed to the scientific space. Scientists have a way to describe color, and nowadays, I mean, I have like a little pocket colorimeter here. I'm not a color scientist, but I've got my little colorimeter. I can hold it up and get colorimetric readings on every, surface in my house if I want to. So so science seems to be fine with where they are. But from the education space, there is a desire to, like Godlove was trying to do, teach color science using sort of a fixed way of thinking about talking about color. So,
Sure, sure.
mhm,
I think there's still things definitely happening in the science area. At the moment, the CIE defines 6 attributes of perceived color: hue, lightness, brightness, colorfulness, saturation, and
mhm,
chroma. But
mhm,
there's committees working on other attributes which are kind of in use in anyway, like blackness, and what's called brilliance, and
mhm,
depth, and
mhm,
versus whiteness and so on. So
mhm,
there's still looking at sort of scientifically defining and sort of examining other attributes of perceived
mhm,
color as alternatives for
mhm,
hue, lightness, and chroma.
mhm.
Yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Next one is absolutely fascinating, far more complex than suspected. Thanks for a great talk. I'm looking forward to reading your book called True Color, I believe, and
Yes.
available.
And I think it's now available for purchase in Australia. I had to
Uh,
ask. I
oh,
didn't know. My publisher didn't tell me. So I
uh,
believe you can now buy it in
yeah.
the
Oh, look,
Southern
I think
Hemisphere. Yeah.
we can get them pretty quickly on Amazon. And there's a
Great.
digital version as well.
Perfect.
I got
Yes.
the
There you
digital version a
go.
while back. Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if it's on the shelves in sort of
Yeah.
old-fashioned bookstores at the moment.
Yeah.
Peggy asks, would you consider your shirt maroon or dark puce?
I believe technically this is mulberry, Peggy. I believe that's what this color is. I, I the mm, Well, in this light, it's dark, it's night for me. So in this light, let's see. This might be a dark puce. This might be doesn't seem red enough for maroon. But see, I'm saying that without looking at a color standard. This is how all people describe color, right?
Yes,
They
yes,
eyeball it and they kind of
yes.
go, it's kind of this, it's kind of that.
Mm, great. Jean Hoskin asks, can you explain a bit about the Miami people's approach to blue and green? How does it compare to the Himba?
Oh, the himba, the poor
Uh,
himba, always always so
yes.
studied. So in Miami culture, I said that I believe the Himba mostly divide up their blues and greens. There's a couple of different terms that they use, but it's mostly by not so much hue, it's lightness, darkness. There's some kind of movement there. Um, for the Miami, it really is there are fixed things that are called one color and fixed things that are called another color. We would just say like water and sky, we would say are canonically blue in English, but those are two different words in Miami. And the problem is it's so contextual that trying to define it well for people who aren't native speakers of it, there are no native speakers of Miami left in America. So this is not just revitalization work, we're also looking at a lot of historical documentation and speaking to a lot of elders to sort of suss out like, would you call this this color or this color?
Uh-huh.
Um, so
Yes.
it's really difficult to try and describe, it's you can't have a dictionary definition that says this, Miami word is the blue of water, the green of cattail reeds, the green of the vegetation near the river, the green of this particular plant, the blue of you can't do
Mhm.
that because people just, they stop reading after the fourth word.
Mhm.
So it's I'm I don't know anything about the Himba language. I'm just going off of what I've read about it, but yeah, it's and the way that the Miami divide up blue and green is different from the way that tribes that literally are across the river historically from our tribe divide up blue and green too. It's all so contextual. It's really difficult to do. If anyone has ideas, please email me.
They're very, very important works. There are still people who can answer those questions, are there? They're not speaking the language.
They're not speaking the language, but ancestral knowledge has been passed down.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Miami is weird because we also have different words for different materials. So we have color words that refer only to man-made materials, paper and fabric mostly. And that complicates things too, because you can have the color that means green, paper, and fabric refers to all greens, but no blues. We don't have a word for the blues. It's kind of a mess. Anyway.
I'll leave that one to you then. There's a couple of questions here. One from Nick Harkness. Is there a link between C Lab and the ISCC dictionary?
You know, there is in that the CIE designations and measurements were taken to compare to help sort of do some more fine-grained Munsell measurements because Munsell, even though it can be wonderfully specific for lay people, it's not nearly specific enough for scientists and industry. So especially as they were creating the standard, the National Bureau of Standards realized we can't just map everything to Munsell. We also need to double check it using CIE values, and they took tri-stimulus values as well. So there is that link. I am not enough of a scientist and scholar of the CIE system to be able to say whether any of the later, CIE XYY was used to help create the Munsell Book of Color. And, we also have Sea Love now, which I barely know anything about because word nerd, not color nerd. So there was a tiny, so they're kissing cousins. There was a point in the creation in which the two things where CIE was brought into ISCC, but they didn't use it in describing. If you read the method, it's
Right.
not in any of the result section
Yeah.
of the ISCC NBS.
Okay, great.
Hmm.
I think this is from Graydon Parish, painter, wonderful painter Graydon Parish.
Hmm.
Munsell attempted this for children. For example, crayons were light, middle, and dark green.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
it seems rather simple until one becomes a poet.
Yeah. Yep.
I think
Yeah.
we can
It's
take.
yeah, much easier to do for with a set of crayons for children, let me tell you.
All right.
Mhm.
Someone is telling us that it's available through Amazon Australia, which is
Thank you, Lorraine.
so we
Thank you for putting that in. Yep.
can probably get it tomorrow if you buy it today, right? Um, all right. These are yeah, and the rest are effusive thank yous. So
Oh, thank you,
mm,
everyone.
okay.
Oh, I'm so glad to have spoken to all of you all. Thank you.
Oh well, like we I was so pleased when you agreed to talk for us, and it's been fantastic. So we'll put this recording up on the Colour Society of Australia YouTube channel, and we'll leave it. We'll make this a free one for everyone. So yes,
Mhm.
great. Oh, and we're getting thank yous coming in. All right. So I think we better wrap it up.
All right.
So thanks so much, Kory, and thanks everyone
Yeah.
for being
Thank you,
here.
everyone.
All
Yep,
right.
I appreciate it. Okay.
Okay.
Have a good morning or evening wherever you
Yes.
are.
Right.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.